So welcome to our next lecture for, pardon me, History 310B. Last lecture, we covered quite a number of related things. We talked about the end of the Korean War, the death of Stalin, and the collective leadership that followed, and of course played an important role in the end of the Korean War. Then talked a little bit about the KGB before moving on to both the CIA in itself and also how the CIA fit into Eisenhower's foreign policy, the so-called New Look. As you recall, the New Look was focused a great deal on treating the Cold War as a longer-term struggle, and thus was quite concerned about the budget. Eisenhower tried to save money by relying on the threat of massive retaliation to deter Soviet aggression. However, since the problems with launching nukes over every little thing is presumably obvious, that left the Eisenhower administration with a problem. What could the United States do in a situation wherein they wanted a particular outcome, but they couldn't use, on a practical level, they couldn't use nukes to achieve it? And so that brings us back to the CIA, which was intended to use covert or secret operations to influence things in a way that suited the American national interest without the dangers or expense of full-scale warfare. I believe that I ended off the last lecture by mentioning that events in Iran and Guatemala in the early mid-1950s seemed to suggest that the CIA plausibly could fill this role that the Eisenhower administration intended for it. And first, we're going to talk about Iran. To backtrack a little bit, I talked about this a little bit earlier. In the early 50s, Iran was a constitutional monarchy with the Shah, the king, sharing power with an elected parliament. And the elected parliament is often referred to as the Majlis, which translates as council. Now, in this system, Mohammad Mossadegh, the fellow you see here, pardon me, on the slide, sometimes you'll see it spelled D-E-Q at the end, or D-E-G-H. But in any case, Mossadegh, he comes to power as prime minister, as head of the Majlis, in April of 1951, with a lot of popular support. He was the leader of a left-wing political party called the National Front. And so the previous prime minister had been assassinated. Mossadegh, steps up as the next prime minister. Now, as I said, Mossadegh was a leftist. He comes in on sort of a pro-reform platform. But when I say he's a leftist, he's a lot closer to our NDP or the British Labour Party than Soviet-style communist. He doesn't have ties to Moscow. He's a leftist. He's, again, what usually referred to in the latter part of the 20th century as a socialist, but not a communist. And that he doesn't have any ties to Moscow, and like I said, he's not a hardcore far left. Once he's in power, Mossadegh undertakes a land reform to help out, again, the poor in the countryside. And more crucially to what we're talking about here is he nationalizes the Iranian oil industry. Now, the Iranian oil industry started to become significant around the start of the 20th century, and then in the interwar period, it really began to boom. But most of the oil money in Iran ended up going to British companies rather than the Iranian population. And so Mossadegh nationalized it. Picked up the private companies, say the Iranian government owns the oil wells, and therefore we will get the money from the production. Now, in doing this, both the land reform and the nationalization of the oil industry, Mossadegh had lots of support from most of the Iranian parliament. Again, not everybody liked it, but most of the parties thought this was a good thing to do. But the British really were mad about losing control of a highly profitable resource that they basically had been controlling for half a century by this point. And so the British tried to get everyone to stop buying Iranian oil. That hit the Iranian economy quite hard, leads to some dissent within Mossadegh's cabinet. In the summer of 1952, the Majlis doubles down on Mossadegh and says, yes, there's a crisis, but we want you to be the one to deal with it. So in the summer of 52, a little after, a year after he took over the prime ministership, as I said, the Majlis doubles down on Mossadegh. They give him emergency powers to rule by decree to try and deal with this economic crisis. Now, among Mossadegh's very active supporters in getting these emergency powers and getting to essentially act like a dictator, important role in getting this for Mossadegh were the Iranian Communist Party, who were the Tudeh, and you see the other term up there on this slide. pardon me, and they were the hardcore communists who did have ties to Moscow. And so it said Mossadegh was not one of them, but he did become sort of a political ally. He was also allied with a number of other political parties, but he does become their political ally as the economic crisis escalates. Now, these actions, again, the British still very annoyed at the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry. It led the British to escalate the trade war, which of course kept hitting the Iranian economy hard. That started to cost Mossadegh some popularity, and so he started to become more dictatorial. He dissolved parliament in the summer of 1953, although he sort of sought public approval for doing so. He called a referendum for the week of August 3rd to 10th, 1953, where the Iranian population was allowed to vote on whether or not they liked Mossadegh dissolving parliament and taking more direct control himself, or whether they wanted to undo it. And the vote went 99.9% in favor of Mossadegh dissolving parliament. There were over 2 million votes in favor, 1,200 against. Now, that is perhaps a distorted result in terms of the actual popularity of the move. There were over 18 million voters, registered voters in Iran at the time, or eligible voters. And so, again, 2 million votes in favor is not not a great bunch of support there. There was, again, most of the opponents boycotted rather than voting no. And there was no secret ballot, where in fact you went to a different polling place if you were going to vote yes or vote no on the referendum. And this really irritated Mossadegh because he thought he could win this referendum fairly. We'll never know for sure. He was quite popular. The parliament was not particularly popular. The Majlis was not particularly popular. And so probably he could have won fair and square, but the way that things play out, it's not run fair and square, so we don't really know what the population wanted. In any case, Mossadegh is, as I said, becoming more and more dictatorial, and somewhere along the line, what's going on in Iran becomes too much for the Americans. In particular, it becomes too much for the CIA and its new head, Alan Dulles, who took over the CIA in February of 1953, becomes the first civilian head of the CIA. As I think I mentioned in the last lecture, and I'll probably mention again, pardon me, Dulles was the brother of John Foster Dulles, who was the Secretary of State from 1953 to 1959. So very, very powerful family there. In any case, as I said, what's going on in Iran becomes too much for the Americans. Again, whether it's Mossadegh's support from the communists or his nationalization of the oil industry that interfered with private business and American investment, which at the time was much smaller than British, but there was still some American private business there. Or it could have just been Mossadegh's apparent drift towards dictatorship. Very likely it was some combination of these three factors, and exactly how big a role each one plays is a matter of debate, but they weren't mutually exclusive. This is something that I think a lot of historians, as well as a lot of history students, often get confused. Say, well, was it 75% this reason and 25% that reason, or was it 60-40 that one and this one, or whatever? When there is, most events in history don't have monocausal explanations. They happen for more than one reason. And unless there is conflicting priorities, unless they're mutually exclusive, the only way you can pursue one priority is by ditching another one. Then, in my opinion, it doesn't typically matter all that much. How much of a percentage was due to him becoming dictatorial, how much it was because of the nationalization of the oil industry. To me, this is something historians do to keep employed, debate about these different proportions. But as I said, to my way of thinking, is that unless these multiple causes are mutually exclusive, we can just say that there were multiple causes for things. And yes, we can probably say, we're saying some are more important or less important, but certainly that both the nationalization of the oil industry and the ties and the increasing sort of political alliance between Mossadegh and the Houthi were things that were very, very alarming to the Americans. And he said the dictatorialism at least provided an excuse and may have been an additional motive beyond that. In any case, Mossadegh is overthrown in August of 1953 in so-called Operation Ajax. Ajax was, in fact, a joint operation between the CIA and British intelligence, MI6, as well as reportedly having the somewhat reluctant participation of the Shah. Shah, we saw him on the last slide, the Shah recognized that Mossadegh was very popular. He didn't necessarily like everything that he was doing. He didn't necessarily hate everything he was doing, but the Shah recognized that Mossadegh was very popular and that Mossadegh was sort of eclipsing his powers. That there was power sharing, but as Mossadegh sort of got emergency powers and so forth, the role of the Shah kept declining. And so he doesn't necessarily want to antagonize his population by getting rid of Mossadegh. He doesn't like everything Mossadegh is doing, so he sort of, as I said, somewhat ambivalently, the Shah throws his support behind Operation Ajax as well. Thus, Mossadegh is removed from power, placed under house arrest until his death from cancer in 1967. After Mossadegh is removed, power starts to become, not overnight, but gradually over time, power starts to become more and more fully concentrated in the Shah himself. And he'll oversee a quite brutal backlash against the left in general and the Tudeh party in particular. And this really helps solidify the Shah as the preeminent political power within Iran. Going from the late 50s, going through the 60s and into the late 70s. Of course, the Shah reprivatizes the oil industry, this time with a much larger role for American companies. I always feel like the British sort of didn't get what they wanted out of this. They were the ones who lost most of the oil wells and lost most of the money, and they were the ones who pushed for the boycott, and they were very active in calling for Ajax and sort of pushing the Americans towards it. And afterwards, the British aren't cut out entirely, but they get a much smaller piece of the action than they had before Mossadegh had nationalized it in the first place. In any case, to go back to the theme here, again, the role of the CIA in American foreign policy, what the Eisenhower administration saw in Operation Ajax was the CIA doing exactly what he had hoped. It seemed like an indication of what covert operations could deliver. And as I said, this dovetailed very nicely with this policy of massive retaliation for larger issues. Now, what seemed like very much an American victory in the short term has a lot of negative consequences in the long term. Over time, the Shah became an increasingly authoritarian dictator, relying not only less on the parliament, but also relying on the Majlis, but also relying much more heavily on his secret police, the Savak, the other term that I have up there on the slide. And as I said, he's able to hold on to power as a dictator until 1979, and that will then his overthrow and his replacement by a theocracy, a religious regime, will send shockwaves that are really still being felt throughout the world today, and we'll talk about that later in the course. In any case, like I said, they get rid of Mossadegh. The oil industry is reprivatized. The Americans get a piece of that action, and the Shah is their buddy. And so, like I said, in the short term, this looks great for the Americans. Over the long term, it doesn't necessarily play out that way. What the Iranian population sees, the way they see this story, is the Americans getting rid of their democratically elected Robin Hood. Mossadegh was robbing from the rich and giving to the poor, and the Americans get rid of them to put in their brutal puppet, the Shah. And this will be a common theme in the Cold War as well. Yes, covert operations can sometimes deliver a particular outcome in the short term, but it often comes with what's the term we usually use for this is blowback. That is, it comes with longer term hidden or unanticipated costs. In this and many other cases, it's a significant blow to American prestige and American popularity that will undermine their position in the longer term. And this happened to the Soviets with their covert operations, their backing factions as well. Again, the superpowers often getting what they want in the short term can antagonize the local population of the country and therefore lose them support over the long term. So Iran, the Americans used the CIA to undertake regime change to bring in a government they found more friendly. Similarly, in Latin America, the next specific example that we're going to talk about is Guatemala, and we'll get there in a few minutes. But in Latin America, the U.S. was similarly always hovering in the background to try and make sure that nothing gets too close to communism, at least insofar as they're able to. Communism was the absolute worst, the mortal enemy, and anything that smacked of communism had to be stopped dead in its tracks in Iran, but even more particularly in Latin America, the area that the Americans tended to regard as their backyard. And of course, the CIA was a very significant tool for trying to stop communism in Latin America. Both Iran and Latin America were part of, along with the Africa and large, most but not all of Asia, they were part of what was referred to at the time as the Third World. To explain this terminology, the First World referred to the rich, free market liberal democracies, what we now typically call the developed countries or the global north, and again, Western Europe, mostly Western Europe and North America, or Canada and the United States. Mexico was, of course, part of North America, but it was considered to be part of the Third World. A few other countries as well. Australia, New Zealand, usually seen as part of the First World. Japan, undoubtedly part of the First World. I don't know if you can see it on this map, but South Korea there is in green, part of the First World. And this map doesn't show it, but a lot of the world, particularly as we move into the late 70s, mid to late 70s and into the 80s, a lot of the world sees Israel as part of the First World, sees Singapore as part of the First World, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Again, there's no hard and fast definitions, but most analysts would have had a few more countries as part of the First World, at least, as I said, by the time we're moving into the 1980s. That was the First World. As I said, they were the richest countries and the democracies, the places where life was the best. The Second World was the Soviet bloc, which was notably less well off. It was not as materially wealthy as the First World. For the most part, they were still quite a bit better off than just about everybody else. And so they were in between the Third World and the First World. Second, I don't feel like that's any particular shock there. So that left the rest of the planet as the Third World. And again, whether China was part of the Second World or the Third World is something that was argued about then and since. But basically, the Third World was everybody who wasn't one of the rich liberal democracies or one of the, part of the Soviet bloc. And the Third World were seen, I guess world is singular, but it's made of many countries, so could use plural. In any case, the Third World were seen as somewhat up for grabs in the Cold War struggle. And so the Third World becomes, in the 1950s, the main arena for the Americans and the Soviets to compete in terms of influence in the world. By this time, the divisions in Europe have really hardened to the point where not much is going to change one way or the other. But the Third World is up for grabs. So that's where, I said, a lot of the Cold War competition gets played out. To remind you of the context, the 1950s were the time in which the European empires were breaking up. And so many former colonies were either gaining their independence or well on their way to doing so. And so you have a whole lot of new countries being formed. Or in some cases, it might be more accurate to say there were older countries regaining their independence. But in any case, you have the creation or reconstitution of a lot of new legal states. And so both the Americans and the Soviets are very anxious to try and get these newly independent states into their orbit. And as I said, that becomes a big part of what the Cold War came to be about, this competition for influence in the Third World, which, as I said, really gets going on Eisenhower's watch in the 1950s. Of course, most of these newly independent countries were quite poor, many problematic legacies of colonialism. So a lot of them said essentially to the effect, they said something like, we don't really care about what either the Russians or the Americans are up to. We have our own problems. We want to focus on our own national and political and economic development. Therefore, in April of 1955, the leaders of several of these newly independent countries met in the Indonesian city of Bandung. It's called the Bandung Conference, representatives of 29 countries who represented over half of the world's population. You have some very big countries here, the two biggest, India and China, as well as Pakistan and Indonesia, and a number of others, Egypt being another sizable country that was quite active there. They all meet to declare a desire to pursue their interests, to pursue these goals of nation building and domestic development, rather than choosing sides in the Cold War. And so, like I said, they basically just all meet and say, hey, the Americans and Russians are always fighting. Do we want to be part of this? No, we got our own priorities. Let's all agree to try and help each other in these things, rather than getting involved in the squabbles of the Russians and the Americans. The idea really gets its genesis in April of 1955 at the Bandung Conference. In 1961, this actually leads to the development of a new formal organization called simply the Non-Aligned Movement. That is, they were not aligned with either the United States or the Soviet Union. And the founding conference of the Non-Aligned Movement, where it goes from being an idea to a formal organization, as I said, this happened in 1961 in Belgrade, Yugoslavia. Tito is a big fan of the non-aligned movement, as he's got this very strange position of being communist but not a Soviet ally. And so he's looking for friends, and there's a whole big chunk of the world who aren't particularly interested necessarily in posing up to the Americans or the Soviets. So Tito tries to give this a big push, and he's quite active in doing so. Sukarno, the leader of Indonesia, was very important in getting the non-aligned movement organized. So was Nehru, the leader of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, Pandit Nehru, and Nasser of Egypt, who we'll talk about later on in the course. But he, probably in the next lecture, we'll talk a little bit about Nasser. But he was also very active in pushing this non-aligned idea, this non-aligned movement forward. And as you can see on this map, most of the so-called Third World joined. Now, this map here, the dark blue are the full members, the light blue are observer members, but some of whom had been full members at some point. But this is as it stands today. Now, as a formal organization, the non-aligned movement is, to be honest, it's really a flop. There was so much diversity among the membership. Some members, like Cuba or South Vietnam, were members of the non-aligned movement and yet very, very clearly aligned. There were a number of benefits to having a superpower patron in the Cold War. And so the non-aligned movement, as a formal organization that tried to sort of make joint decisions and issue joint statements and agreements of how they were going to behave or what they thought of what was going on in the world, all this basically falls flat. They can never really get anything done as a formal group. But as an informal group, as an idea where most members agreed most of the time, it worked very, very well. And the non-aligned movement continues to be very significant today and really continues to be an important factor in the international arena. And they're still officially referred to as the non-aligned movement, even though the alignment part is perhaps moot in the post-Cold War era. But most of their other goals remain the same from what they had going back to the mid-1950s. Wanting to promote their economic development, often this means seeking aid to pursue this economic development, or loans in general terms, or loan forgiveness and things like that. Trying to preserve their sovereignty, their freedom of action against impositions from richer countries, seeking an end to exploitative economic relations and what we call neo-colonialism and so forth. More recently, a common goal of much of this sort of informal idea of a non-aligned movement, a common goal has been to try to make sure that rich countries, the West or the global North, picks up most of the tab for doing something about global warming. dealing with global warming is going to be expensive. The West has the money and has pumped out most of the pollution so far. And so the non-aligned movement is trying to say, look, this is a problem you created. This is a problem you got rich creating. So this is a problem that you should be solving, rather than putting the cost of greening the world onto us. Most notably, again, as an informal grouping, the sort of association in principle, the non-aligned movement has for a long time controlled the United Nations General Assembly. Anything that goes, decisions in the General Assembly are one country, one vote, and most countries of the world see themselves, said formally and mentally, at least to a significant degree, as part of this non-aligned movement. And so that often impacts United Nations policies in a number of ways. And again, the General Assembly will vote for not what the Americans want or what the Soviets will want, or in the post-Cold War world, what the Russians want or the Chinese want or anything like that. They'll vote with what they want, again, which is what the non-aligned movement wants. Now, the General Assembly has fairly limited powers. It's mostly a talking shop. The Big Five dominate the Security Council, and they're the only ones who really lead to action. But it still becomes a significant factor in how the UN actually operates. And as I said, that has a number of impact on UN policies. And the General Assembly can't do anything, but they can make recommendations. They can say, hey, we like what this side is doing, we condemn what that side is doing, and so forth. And those decisions in the General Assembly will usually go the way that the non-aligned movement wants them to. In any case, to go back to where we picked up this thread in the first place, the US and the Soviets are competing for influence. The third world has become the global arena, and Latin America was a third world region that the Americans considered particularly important because they saw it as their political, their geographic, and their economic backyard. The best example of this American attitude in the period, again, how they saw Latin America and the American role in Latin America during the Cold War, the clearest example of this is what takes place in Guatemala. Guatemala in Central America traditionally has been one of the poorer Latin American states, whether you measure it directly economically by GDP, or whether you're measuring by literacy or health and life expectancy. Again, Guatemala is one of the poorer countries in the Americas. It has also been held up sometimes as one of the closest real-life examples of the stereotype that's sometimes referred to as the banana republic. Banana republic is a sort of a stereotype, is a catch-all term for a small, poor Latin American country, usually run by their military, either openly or behind a civilian facade, with an economy reliant on agricultural exports, coffee, bananas, hence the term banana republic, or so forth. And as I said, no country really fits this stereotype to a T, but Guatemala fits the criteria as good as just about any in the world. And again, so poor agricultural country run by the military, again, sometimes openly, sometimes they had a civilian front man, but the military really ran the show in terms of the government in Guatemala historically. And it said very poor. In the early 50s, it has a GDP per capita of about $100 per person per year. Most of the population works on the land without owning much of it. Either they have a very tiny piece, or they're working on somebody else's land. Most of the agricultural land in Guatemala was owned by the United Fruit Company from Boston. Again, the United Fruit Company was often seen as a very powerful agent of American economic influence in Latin America. Perhaps coincidentally, perhaps not, one of the members of the board of directors of the United Fruit Company was Allen Dulles, head of the CIA. His brother John Foster Dulles, also a significant shareholder, although he wasn't on the board himself. So again, I'll get back to this a little bit later, but that is, if it's a coincidence or not, that's often probably holds up some measure of significance. In any case, in 1951, the fellow you see here, Colonel Jacobo Arbenz, the son of a Swiss immigrant and something of a moderate leftist, unlike Mossadegh, partly because of his wife. His wife appears to have pushed him a little bit further to the left politically. But in any case, Arbenz takes over the presidency of Guatemala in what was the country's first ever universal suffrage election. That is the first time women could vote, was in 1951. And also that was Guatemala's first ever real peaceful transition of power. After winning the election, Arbenz, again, he runs on a pro-reform but not radical communist reform ticket. And once he's in power, Arbenz undertakes quite significant land reform being the burning issue in Guatemala at the time, as I said, an agrarian economy. But he doesn't simply, now when I say he undertakes significant land reform, Arbenz doesn't just sort of decree that all the privately owned land should be chopped up and handed over to the peasants, the way that had happened in the Russian Revolution and a number of other sort of communist revolutions. Arbenz is trying to be very thoughtful and very sort of introspective, very careful in terms of how he carries out this land reform. He mostly has the backing of the World Bank for things that he's doing. And the World Bank is often seen as a fairly right-wing organization. But given the sort of economic context of what was going on in Guatemala, everybody could see that some sort of land reform was needed, and even the World Bank mostly thought Arbenz was doing a good job of it. Again, the Spanish tradition, you have two last names from your mother and your father, but Arbenz is the one that is used more commonly. Pardon me. Now, in any case, like I said, he comes into power, moderate reformer, but going to undertake a significant but careful land reform. What Arbenz imposed was that for large estates, that smallholders and medium-sized holders wouldn't be affected, but for large estates, and the definition of a large estate was 670 acres, metric 270 hectares. For large estates, those over 270 hectares, 2/3 of the land, if it wasn't being used, could be handed over for redistribution, as long as it was relatively flat, as long as there wasn't too much slope. Again, Guatemala is a very mountainous country, and there isn't a lot of good flat agricultural land. It's not impossible to grow on hills, but it's quite problematic if you don't terrace them. Then you get a lot of runoff, and over time you'll do a lot of damage to the soil and so forth. And so again, it's not that you can't farm on hilly land, and poor people often have to do it, but it's not a very advisable or productive way to farm land if you have a choice. And again, under this land reform, he would have lost, Arbenz himself would have lost about 1,700 acres of land as well, so he wasn't, he didn't exclude him from this. So, as I said, he comes in with this, quite detailed blueprint, and it's a well thought out blueprint for how he was going to undertake land reform that was seen, as I said, as absolutely necessary given the huge size of the poor agrarian population. Most of the land was in the hand of a very small proportion of the population. 2% of the population of Guatemala owned 72% of the land. Now, again, in a society where, in Canada, I have no idea what the percentage of the population owns most of the land, but very few of us want to live in rural Saskatchewan and have a huge farm. Our economy doesn't rely on agriculture. But in an agrarian economy, in an economy where most people do work on the land, having such an unequal land distribution is an absolutely huge problem. Also, to go back to the idea that unused land should be seized, large amounts of Guatemala's land, even the good farmland, was uncultivated. Given one of the problems of being a banana republic, and applies to a lot of third world countries in general, is your economy tends to be heavily reliant on the price of one particular product. Just like Alberta, Alberta does well when oil prices are high and struggles when oil prices are low, and usually blames a political party when oil prices are low. But no Canadian or Albertan provincial party controls the world oil price, but that's a digression there. In any case, said agricultural products, coming from Guatemala weren't getting a good return at that time. So a lot of the United Fruit Company, a lot of big landholders were just letting a lot of their land lie fallow rather than trying to grow on it, or they weren't going to get much money for their product anyway. And so, like I said, you have this large amount of land being being left unused, while you also have this very large rural population with little to no land of their own, trying to scrape by and having a great deal of difficulty in doing so. Another part, I'm perhaps going into this in a fair amount of detail, but the point I like getting into this in quite a bit of detail because, again, I want to really be clear about this point, that this was just not a crazy, chop up land and give it away communist stereotype of land reform here. And that Arbenz is trying to do this very, in a way that is as smart and as possible. And so another aspect of this is if your land was taken, the government just didn't say, okay, this land is ours and give you a kick in the ass. You got something in return. Arbenz issued government bonds as compensation. Essentially, it means the government would pay you for the land, but over time. Now, the amount of, I always think this is clever, the amount that you got as in your bonds, like the amount the government gave you for your land that you were losing, was the amount that you said it was worth when you paid taxes on it. Pardon me again. So if an owner tries to minimize the value of their land when paying taxes, as most people or most companies tend to do, then you get less compensation. But you get compensation nevertheless. And again, to talk about the sort of gap between what they claimed the land was worth when they were paying taxes on it and what they claimed the land was worth when they want to be compensated for losing it, there's a very significant discrepancy. In their 1952 taxes, the United Fruit Company claimed on average that their land was worth $3 an acre, and they wanted, when Arbenz brings in its nationalization program, they want to be compensated at $75 an acre. So pretty big discrepancy there. In any case, as I said, Arbenz's policies were, in the eyes of most experts, both domestic and foreign, quite reasonable reforms, a necessary step to move the country forward out of poverty. Yes, there's going to be some losers, but losers' losses are going to be mitigated, and it's going to bring the country as a whole tremendous benefit. However, this is obviously seen as a huge threat to the big landowners. The United Fruit Company, the largest landowner of all, less than a quarter of their holdings were cultivated, which meant that they were vulnerable to have it taken away. Under all these restrictions and conditions, so forth, that might be taken, the United Fruit Company was only going to lose about 15% of their holdings in Guatemala. But that's still their holdings are still vast. That's still a very big chunk of farmland. And as I touched on before, John Foster Dulles, the American Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, first civilian director of the CIA, were both shareholders in the United Fruit Company, and Allen was on the board of directors. And so that ensured those in power in the United States, would pay attention. And they may have anyway, but again, that ensured that they would pay attention. You've probably heard the phrase access is power. And again, when you talk about the idea that, again, it gets talked about a lot, the idea that sort of big business controls politics, or money controls politics. So far as we know, rarely, if ever, does the head of a big corporation call up a politician and say, do what I say, or else I'm going to, give a ton of money to your opponent and have you lose the next election. But that access is power. Those who have money and those who give a lot of money to political candidates, they can go to fundraising dinners. If they make a phone call, their phone call gets returned. And so, like I said, access is power, and money can often buy access. And this is sort of already built in the case of Guatemala and the United Fruit Company. So a big American corporation is threatened by the land reform. Also, as I said, Arbenz campaigned on a fairly moderate left-wing platform. Once he's in power, he starts to drift further to the left than it sort of appeared he was going to be during the campaign. One of the things he did was legalize the Communist Party in Guatemala. And the Communist Party has almost no influence in Parliament, negligible direct political influence, but they were quite active in the trade union movement, and that trade union movement was reasonably, was significant. And so this gave the communists, some power within Guatemala. And also, another thing Arbenz did that sort of alarmed the Americans, like Nasser in Egypt, which we'll talk about later in the course, I think again in the next lecture, but Arbenz starts to buy guns from the Soviet bloc. specifically from Czechoslovakia. Major weapons producer for the Soviet bloc. Arbenz starts buying guns from them and tries to hide it. He essentially lies about it, but the American intelligence finds out about it anyway. Again, the idea being, well, whoever's providing your guns is sort of underpinning your political stability, and so this is often seen as a sign, buying guns from the Soviet Union is often seen as a sign that a government is thinking of aligning with the Soviet Union or moving towards the Soviet Union in the Cold War. As in Iran, somewhere, and we can't say precisely where, but somewhere all of this becomes too much for the Americans to take, with the active support of the American CIA, who help organize and plan this and train people for it and carry out propaganda and so forth. With the active support of the American CIA, groups in the Guatemalan military, who had close ties to the landowning elite, stage a coup in June of 1954. So, again, less than a year after Mossadegh was overthrown in August of 1953. Power in Guatemala passed to Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas. And again, I won't, I don't have his name up there on the slide, means I don't expect you to know it. But the new regime promptly undoes the land reforms, which becomes one factor in a civil war that will really cause a lot of suffering in Guatemala in the 1960s. So this case of Arbenz in Guatemala is probably the most famous example of direct American involvement in Latin America during the Cold War. And again, some really sort of tag this to the political influence of big business. Most foreign policy scholars like myself tend to see ideology as the key, and the United Fruit Company didn't like it, and that again perhaps pushed the issue forward on the agenda a little bit further. But even if there weren't these direct ties, the Americans probably would have done it anyway, just as Arbenz was drifting further to the left and looking like a possible Soviet ally. But again, the CIA acted as an important instrument of American foreign policy. They delivered an apparent victory in the short term, playing the part assigned to them by Eisenhower under the new look. And that's where we'll end off this lecture, and I'll get the next lecture will be a bit of a shorter one, and I should get that up later today.